You ready to film another exciting episode of Real Good at Doing Stuff?
I can't wait.
Gotta be more exciting for TV.
I can't wait.
Okay, good. There we go. We're back to Real Good at Doing Stuff. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. Maybe subscribe, comment, like, whatever. Since our last video, the channel has like literally doubled. So there might be a lot more of you than normal checking things out here. We talk about tech, race cars, all kinds of drag racing related stuff. Some of it's serious, some of it's not at all. But anyhow, today I thought we would talk a little bit about the starting line, what happens on the starting line, and maybe some misconceptions of what happens on the starting line that I've heard from both novices, and sometimes I'll hear comments from people with some you would think expertise in this regard that kind of belie the fact that they may not quite understand exactly what's happening on the starting line. It's a kind of misunderstood spot. And when we're talking about today, we're talking about the intersection of boost and RPM today. That's a specific thing. We'll probably revisit this at some point and talk about other factors. But today we're going to talk about boost and RPM and the differences between the two and how you need to think about these things when you make decisions about your starting line tune. And when I talk about the starting line today, we're talking about trans brake release. What happens immediately when you let off that button. I'm not talking about when you zip the tires 4/10 in. That's a separate deal, right? Today we're talking about the starting line. If you zip the tires right when you let off the button, why did that happen? Okay. For today, I've got a plethora of viewing aids.
Would you say I have a plethora of piñatas? A what?
To maybe help us understand what happens on the starting line. I've got various forms of hammers. I got big rubber hammers. I got this little bronze hammer here, brass hammer, kind of a plasticky type hammer, steel hammer, adjustable hammer, big steel hammer. All right, well, we're talking about turbo cars primarily, although this does apply to other types of cars. The same principles apply. The difference with a turbo car is that your starting line RPM and your boost are uncouplable. They don't have to be the same every time. Like you can leave the line at 4,000 RPM and 6 pounds of boost, or 4,000 RPM and 12 pounds of boost. You know, it's adjustable more so than it is with your regular blower setup. We're not talking about weird blower setups, but just your standard blower deal. All right, so with your torque converter, the design of your torque converter is one of the biggest factors here, right? A looser converter is much more forgiving on the starting line. Now, let's say you got an all-motor car that, and with converter X, when the amount of power behind this, or that this particular motor we're talking about makes, let's say that it flashes 6,000 RPM, right? Well, if you leave the line at 3,000 RPM, that means you kind of got about 3,000 more RPM of slush before that converter gets hard and tight, right? At 6,000, it's kind of tight. So conversely, if you leave the line at 6,000 RPM, that's why it's way more likely to shock a tire and knock a tire off, right? Now the same thing applies in turbo deals. Obviously you're not going to have an all-motor converter that flashes 6,000 RPM. But where you leave, let's say from 3,000 to 45 or whatever you're leaving at, will change how hard that converter acts. The more RPM you leave with, the tighter that thing acts. And another factor here is the actual pressure in there. We do a lot of things to manage pressure in the torque converter at various points in the racetrack. But just raising your RPM effectively raises the pressure in there a lot of times, right? And what I'm getting at is the tighter your converter is and the higher you're leaving, the more you're leaving with a really solid converter. All right, so let's look at this in relation to these hammers I got laid out. If you have something with a kind of slushy converter and you leave a line with a relatively low RPM, you could say, all right, well, we're kind of leaving with like a rubber hammer. We're hitting the tires with a rubber hammer, right? And we can go on through them. As we tighten things up a little bit, brass hammer. And then hit it really hard, we got a steel hammer. Now that impact that the racetrack and the tire feels becomes more and more violent, and it becomes more and more dependent on the racetrack being primo, especially with you radio guys, to absorb that. So that's the fine line that we walk, or that we've got to deal with. If you leave with too low of RPM, we need RPM to generate boost, right? Especially if we're trying to get a lot of boost to push on the converter after the trans brake release, right? If you want to really go, you can't leave with 5 pounds of boost. That's not going to work. So we've got to, with a turbo car, we can make these things, we can separate these things, right? So think of it this way: if you're leaving really hard and hammering the tire, then you've got a lot of boost behind it. Think of it as having a steel hammer to take your tire, but also a lot of mass afterwards that's going to drive that converter and push things on. When you hit that thing immediately afterwards, you're going to push up hard on your converter. Now that's what you need when you want to go really fast. But if the track's iffy, you can't go hitting that tire in that racetrack with a steel hammer, right? You've got to back off on RPM. So in other words, what I'm getting at is it's entirely possible to zip your tires completely off and not even have hardly any boost in it, just because you're way too hard with the converter, right? You're making your converter too tight with pressure and RPM, right? Now, some other things. There's some things that have nothing to do with your starting line, your button release, zipping to the tires, right? And these may be somewhat controversial takes, but in my opinion, it's totally true. Your suspension doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Now, 4/10 into the run, when you zip the tires, okay, that totally may be a suspension related thing. But I'm talking about when you let off the button and zip them. In my opinion, at this point, your suspension doesn't really have anything to do with it, right? The converter and the tire pressure, and there's other factors that have much more to do with it at this point, right? Traction control doesn't have anything to do with it. I wish that I could sell you a traction control device that could help you out on the starting line. Doesn't exist. For this to work, you'd have to have a traction control that can go back in time and undo mistakes that you've made in the tune-up, right? Because once you get to this point, the energy's already generated. It's already in the converter. It's ready to go. All you're doing is letting go of it. You can't undo that with traction control, right? So now, 4 5/10 into the run, you know, traction control starts to play a point. If you get into trouble, it can maybe help you out. But on the starting line, it ain't gonna do squat, and you can take that to the bank. And that's pretty much universal. That applies to blower cars, nitrous cars, anything, you know. Like I say, I'm not talking about what happens 4 5/10 into the run, a second into the run, 2 seconds into the run. I'm talking about a trans brake release, right? This is where boost and RPM come into play here, but you need to learn how to separate the two and understand which one is getting you in trouble, right? And if it's happening immediately when you let off the button, more likely it's converter related and RPM related, not necessarily boost.